All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we begin today, we just want to read a quick disclaimer. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during the webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today we'll be hearing from a trio of folks on parental involvement in K-12 online and blended learning, and before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to introduce them. First, we have with us Dr. Mike Menchaca, who is a professor in the Department of Learning Sciences and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He specializes in online learning, technology integration, and social justice with technology. He currently coordinates all hybrid programs in his department. We also have with us Dr. Jered Borup, who's an assistant professor in the Division of Learning Technologies at George Mason University. Dr. Borup earned his PhD in Instructional Psychology and Technology from Brigham Young University in 2013. Previous to earning his PhD, Jered taught history at a junior high school for 6 years. He has taught online and blended courses since 2008, and in his current position, he is working to build the integration of online learning in schools' master's and certificate program, which began its first cohort in the fall of 2014. He recently served as a fellow for George Mason's Office of Distance Education and led an initiative that prepared faculty for the challenges of online instruction. His current research interests include developing online learning communities and identifying support systems that adolescent learners require to be successful in online environments. We also have with us Lisa Hasler Waters from the Flint Hill School in Oaktan, Virginia, and I'll let her talk a little bit about her experience when the time comes. With that, I will pass it over to our presenters. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to start us off here. I should say that this was a book chapter that we wrote for the Handbook of Research of K-12 Online and Blended Learning. Catherine, I wonder if you could put a link in the chat window for people. And I kind of came as a latecomer to this chapter. Lisa and Mike wrote the first parts, and then I added some at the end. And just kind of as a side note, that was kind of funny. Lisa and I are both living in Fairfax, Virginia, and we did all this collaboration. We just met last week, I think, or a couple of weeks ago, face to face for the first time. So this really was an online collaboration. Because we have a small group, and I think that's kind of to be expected after a long weekend. I think we're all kind of behind in what we put off over the weekend and trying to catch up. So it's a busy time for everybody. I wonder if everyone just could kind of introduce themselves in the chat window and maybe talk a little bit about any work that you've done with parents, or maybe your own experience as a parent of an online student or something like that. So if we could just do that in the chat window, I don't know if... Okay, I see someone's typing. Okay, so parent, special ed advocate, that's great. Kristen, that's great, blended learning specialist. Do you do any work with parents at all, or, I mean, I guess, any direct work with parents? I'm glad that we have a online teacher. So I think, Laura, you have a unique perspective on this and how to work with parents of online students. And Kristen, you're not alone. I think we all need to do more. So, okay, great. So I'll go ahead and get going on the presentation. There was an article that was published just a few months ago by Lowe's and Lynn, and it was on locus of control and kind of motivational issues. And the very first sentence in the article was really perfect, and it really summarized what we've been interested in for a long time. And they said that when students take an online course, they're really doing two things. One is they're trying to learn the content, and then the other thing is that they're trying to learn how to learn online. And that can be extremely difficult. They're used to learning in a face-to-face environment, and when they move to an online environment, they require different skills. They need more self-regulation abilities. They need more motivation to complete learning activities and to persist in an online environment, and just different learning skills in general, because the activities tend to be a little different. And so because of that, online students really require assistance from adults who can provide mentoring and guidance. And there's really three models where online programs are doing this. And we're going to talk about all three just very briefly and then focus on the last one. So the first one is on-site mentors, and we've done other presentation on this, but and MVLRI is doing a lot of work with this. But basically, students are taking most of their coursework in a face-to-face environment and maybe supplementing that with one or two online courses. What some programs have begun to do is they hire a mentor at the brick and mortar school to work with the student directly face-to-face, preferably regularly. And then also that mentor works as a liaison or communication link between parents, students, and teachers. So that works for supplemental programs. For full-time programs, these students don't really walk into a brick and mortar school, and so it can be more challenging to provide them with that mentoring help. One school in Utah, Mountain Heights Academy, one solution that they found is that they took their core teachers or the teachers at their school, and a teacher might be teaching 100 students, so the S's here, these are students, the pegmen with the S's. And this is what their courses look like, and you can tell that this would be quite challenging for a science teacher or any teacher to mentor all of these students. And so what they've done is that they've assigned the science teacher to specific students and then asked them to mentor them through the coursework. And then the math teacher has different teachers and or different students. The history teacher has different students that they're mentoring, and the English teacher has different students that they're mentoring. So every student is assigned to a teacher that kind of provides them with the additional support that they need to be successful. The other model, and the model that we're really going to focus on in this presentation, is parents as mentors. And this is common in full-time programs as well, where students are learning from home, and so parents act as a learning coach and really have the primary mentoring responsibilities. But even in the other models that we showed you before with the online mentors or the on-site mentors, parents still play an important role. And if you just think about even in a face-to-face environment where it's highly regulated or structured, parents still play an important role. Even though students are familiar with that style of learning and have lots of face-to-face interaction with the teacher, parents still play a critical role. So even if we're talking about the other types of mentoring, parents still play an important role, but in some cases, parents are the primary mentor. And so that's really what this presentation is going to focus on, is parents as mentors. With that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Okay, thanks a bunch, Jered. I'll just do a little side diversion and let you all know that I am currently working at Flint Hill School. We are a one-to-one school, and we do a lot of work online, although the kids are definitely here throughout the day. So it's a little bit different from my previous experience. I did do my PhD program. Dr. Menchaca was my wonderful chair and advisor, so I love to have him still supporting me along the way, even long after the degree. So thanks a lot for that, Mike. I really appreciate it. And this study actually started when I was a parent of 2 children. I had enrolled in a cyber charter school, and my interest came because I was a teacher. I had been working on my PhD at the time, and I had my 2 children, who at the time were in elementary school, enrolled in a cyber charter school in Hawaii. And it was just an incredible learning experience, and probably one of the most challenging teaching experiences I had ever had, because it was my own 2 kids. So that's what inspired me to really look deeper into this whole concept of parents as parental involvement in these types of alternative schools, because I just thought to myself, wow, I mean, I wonder if anybody else was having as challenging of a time as I was. Nothing to do with necessarily the schooling part, but just the negotiating between parent/teacher at the same time. So that's kind of my background, and happy to share more if anybody is interested later. So just to kind of set the foundation, we wanted to make sure that we all came to the same agreement on what we meant by parental involvement. And so this is sort of the definition that we landed on. I don't want to read it to you, but in particular, the 3 little bullets are important to notice, because they kind of separate when you're talking about a mentor versus a parent, even though the parent, at times is wearing both of those hats. So that's sort of kind of just a little foundation there on the definition of parental involvement. Okay, let me move on to the next slide. So this study is a result of a comprehensive review of research that Jered, Mike, and I engaged in when Catherine Kennedy approached us and invited us to be part of the handbook. And so we did a review of the research. There's not a lot out there currently that explores parental involvement in K-12 online and blended learning. Of course, as we know, there's a lot of information on parental involvement in traditional schools, but we really wanted to take a look at what's the literature and research saying about parental involvement in these K-12 online schooling. And we found that there were 3 significant themes, and those are shown here: continuum of involvement, links to student achievement, and roles, behaviors, and perceptions of parents. So let me go into each one of those themes. Okay, so let's just start off with some sort of demographics. We really do not know very much about the demographic profiles of parents of the children in these schools, other than that a few of the studies that we found suggested that the typical predictive factors of demographics and how parents support their students do not necessarily play out in the online world. What we did learn is that of the studies we found, most of the parents who have children enrolled in these schools have at least some college. They come from middle-income families, but that's really about all we can say. And we really can't generalize too much from these studies, because the studies that have so far been concerned with parental involvement in K-12 online learning have not really been very broad or contained large participants. So it's sort of hard to generalize some of the findings. But what we do know is that we need to do some more research in this area to better understand what motivates parents to enroll their students. And perhaps by understanding that, we can have a better perspective of how we might be able to support the diverse student populations and their families in these schools. So let me jump into the continuum of involvement. So you see the little icon off to the left of your screen says full involvement to no involvement on the right-hand side of the screen. And so we found that, obviously, for a whole bunch of different reasons, parents sort of fall somewhere within this continuum. And sometimes they move up and down the continuum depending on the child or the type of needs that the child has. But what we have learned is that there's sort of 4 areas that influence the way that parents support their children in these schools. And the first one is school policies. So we found some of the studies reporting that low levels of parental involvement could be the result of poor communications from the school explaining to parents what's expected of them. And a couple of studies suggested that schools really need to provide clear and concise details to parents about what they're expected to contribute toward their child's learning. And also, parents should know what they can expect teachers to be doing. We found a handful of studies that suggested that, that when the expectations or the responsibilities are unclear, this can result in problems or issues between the teachers and the parents and understanding of how involved they should be. The second theme that we found here under continuum of involvement, again, relates back to parent demographics. So the studies that we found have really only poked at what motivates parents to enroll their students, but they haven't really uncovered what drives the way they support their own children. But some of these studies have suggested that demographics do not necessarily have a predictive effect. So again, we're sort of unclear. It's kind of murky. Knowing more about the parents would certainly help us to better support parents. And then the third area is student perceptions. So we did learn, and Jered's done a lot of work in this area, that students highly value their parents' involvement and actually do find it motivational. And interestingly, there's sort of no conclusive evidence that suggests that high parental involvement means student academic success, and I'll address that in just a second. But one study by Bolton found that students who found that their parents were minimally involved tended to drop from courses. So that was kind of an interesting finding. And another study found that some parents may not even have understood the motivational value of their involvement for their children. So that theme of student perceptions is really important in helping parents to understand how students value their help and their support. A third implication is student needs. So some studies have found that when students struggle academically in these schools, there tends to be a higher level of parental involvement. But again, a couple of the studies have found that parental instructional support does not necessarily lead to greater student achievement. So this is kind of an interesting conundrum or an inverse effect, suggesting that perhaps there's the lack of parental content knowledge, or perhaps the lack of parental understanding of how to best support their students with pedagogical strategies may have been the cause of the sort of the inverse effect of their more support, but not necessarily higher student achievement. And so obviously we need to do a little bit more research on that end. So, and kind of segueing on the big theme that we found was it's quality, not quantity. So, in other words, a high level of parental involvement doesn't necessarily guarantee student academic success. Now, I should issue a caveat. There's certainly not a lot of research that has looked at the links between parental involvement and student achievement, but there has been recently some news coming out suggesting that students in these schools are not faring as well academically as compared to students in traditional schools. And some students are even dropping out at higher rates in some of these schools. So there certainly needs to be, there's certainly a call to action, I think, here with regards to really understanding how parental involvement can support student academic success. Okay, so let's move on to the third theme, the roles, behaviors, and perceptions. Some of the research out there, and Jered could also add to this as well, has sort of found that parents tend to take on 4 different roles. I think maybe Jered has discovered a little bit deeper here, but let me just review what we found. So there's 4 roles that parents tend to engage in when they support their children in these schools. They're organizers, meaning that they're helping to plan the students' daily schedule, maybe plan lessons or activities that students will be doing, and they're gathering and collecting materials. They also act as an instructor, maybe providing one-on-one instruction or what we might call tutoring. They share educational experiences with students and help them learn and work through content, and they construct knowledge with students. They're the motivators. They motivate students to progress and work through problems, and importantly, they really nurture the students. And that might be for obvious reasons, but it certainly was something that's been coming out in the research, is this element of nurturing their children through these this type of schooling. And then there are also managers, which is a little bit different than organizers. In this case, manager means they're sort of keeping track of students' progress. They're helping the student to manage his or her time and to be disciplined and work through problems, and monitoring their success. So in a study that I completed actually for my dissertation, I used the Hoover, Dempsey, and Sandler model as a framework to measure parental behaviors of support. And that model has been around for some time, and it's specifically used in traditional school settings, but I wanted to look at it as a guide for exploring the behaviors of parents in online charter schools. So looking beyond just the roles that parents played, I was interested in what kind of behaviors they engaged in. And they did tend to engage in the 4 behaviors that have been found in parental involvement of traditional schools, that is, encouraging their students, reinforcing what they're learning, modeling how to learn or how to work through problems, and then instructing them. But importantly, I found that there were 2 other behaviors that parents in my study were engaging in, and those were termed adapting and leveraging. So adapting is basically a behavior in which parents adjust instructional strategies, even learning environments, daily schedules, and even their own belief systems to accommodate their children's learning needs. And this was just a really interesting finding, because what I learned was that parents went out of their way to make sure that they were creating a learner-centric experience for their children. And one, they certainly could, because they were deeply involved and intimately aware of what their children were doing with regards to the schoolwork. And also as a parent, you know, that's sort of your main motivator, is making sure that your child is doing the best that he can. But also they were interested in making sure that the learning was really enjoyable, and that they were loving how they were learning. And then the second behavior was what I called leveraging. And in this case, leveraging is defined as a behavior in which parents access support and materials from a huge variety of sources to meet their children's learning needs. And this might be anything from curating resources online to even reaching out to an uncle who might be a math expert, or an auntie who might be excellent at digital photography. They would do whatever was within their toolkit powers to make sure that they provided their students with learning opportunities, learning instruction and support to the best of their abilities. And ultimately, what I learned was that these parents really wanted to create a very learner-centric environment for their children. I'm sorry, I've kind of ignored the chat on the side, so if there's anything that you have any questions along the way, just let me know. Sorry about that. I'll make sure to go back through it. Okay, so the third element is when we're talking about roles, behaviors, and perceptions. These are some of the things that parents suggested that were must-haves for them in order to do their job well as, oh, thanks, Mike, to do their jobs well as supporters of their children in these schools. So obviously, technology is a must-have, but they talked a lot about you know, being savvy with technology, being willing to adapt themselves, being willing to learn themselves, and the importance that the school provides tech support, if you will, or a help desk that they can easily access. The parents that I interviewed also were adamant that they wanted training on pedagogical strategies and strategies on how to keep their students motivated. And I thought that that was really important because they certainly learned how to navigate the learning management system. You know, they understood all of the daily sort of management of students. But what they really wanted was sort of deeper training on what we teachers get when we go to teacher school. And I thought that that was a really interesting perspective that they had, that they recognize the importance of specific strategies. And even if the material is all online, a lot of times they felt that, you know, that there was more that they could do or different ways that they could help their children understand the materials and the contents. And then the parents also communicated that they really appreciated it when teachers provided them with timely feedback. And I think we can all agree that that is important. Now, this graph comes from a study done by Curtis. She was interested in looking at parents' perspective concerning what they think, what makes their students successful in these environments. And she found this sort of interlocking relationship between the school, the students, and the parents. And the diagram here shows how each facet is interlocked and drives the success of the students. Importantly, what Curtis found was that the parents believed that most success, or student success, I should say, was based on the student's own responsibility for their learning. And parents in her study said that it was really important that the student was also engaged with their schoolwork and accountable for what they had learned. And this finding corroborates what Lipke found way back in the late 90s with a study that he had conducted in a cyber school where parents and teachers suggested that student responsibility was half of the key to success for students doing well online. All right, does anybody have any questions? Because I'm about to turn this over to Mike.
Thank you, Lisa. If someone can pop in the Curtis reference in the chat, I think that's the question there. Thanks. First of all, I just want to thank my research collaborators for putting up with me. I live in Hawaii, and I bop back and forth between California and Hawaii quite a bit. Sometimes Hawaii is 5 hours difference, sometimes 6 hours difference, sometimes it's California. So what that is all to say is that inevitably I missed just about every online meeting that we had scheduled because I would confuse the time. It's really not that hard, but for some reason it was difficult for me. So I appreciate my research collaborators. It's interesting because sometimes beginning research is actually a statement of the obvious. So, you know, I think our overarching findings, our earth-shattering conclusion and recommendation overall in the study was that parental engagement in online settings is complex. Ooh, well, duh. But, you know, at least we had some research underpinnings to support that. You know, it's kind of a dichotomy of understanding that for schools they need parental engagement, but it's a very difficult thing to manage and understand. It is complex, but it's also the best solution for the students. So that's the kind of, you know, the creative tension there, I guess, between understanding that yes, we need to have parental engagement, and it's difficult, but you know it's needed, as some of the chat notes were saying, is that, well, without parental involvement, you know, that's when we get these dropouts or students not succeeding, and we need research to back that up. So, you know, currently, understanding parental engagement suffers from quite a few things, many of which my colleagues mentioned, and that's that there's a lack of research about it. There's a lack of definition of the setting itself. You know, is it virtual? Is it cyber? Is it blended? Is it hybrid? Is it online? What do we call it? What does it look like? There's no clear understanding of what parental involvement actually is. What is it? What should it look like? What should parents be doing? Is there any kind of standards that we might even begin to mention, or is that something that would be up to the local organization? There's a lack of clear school policy at most schools as to how to both engage and support and define parental involvement, and then there's a lack of training and support that's provided for these parents. Yet the modicum of research that we have suggests that this is really important, so we probably should get it right. These settings need parental involvement, and that can really address a host of issues that we discovered, you know, student support issues, time management issues, student motivation issues, all of those different kinds of things. So very interesting, because I really think that this is a burgeoning area of research, and it's very satisfying, because although some of it is self-evident, we're taking that body of research from other disciplines and really looking at it. Okay, we need to understand these online settings as well. So some of the interesting findings that we found. Some of these, a little review from what my colleague said as well, that students really do desire parent involvement. And some of the research that we found, that's what the students said. Interestingly enough, the parents may be under the assumption that students don't want them to be involved because of the parent-child relationship and how complex that can be. And if you have a teenager, I'm sure you know what I mean, especially in the teenage years during high school, but at any times, you know, that conflict between not wanting the parent being there and needing the parent to be there at the same time. But students definitely want it, so parents should understand that although it may not always appear that way, that is definitely, yes, love my teenager too, Lisa. Also, that parents tend to get more involved when there are issues, and that meaning bad issues, like, you know, students are not doing well, students are not participating, or there's other issues that are going on in the family dynamic or in the school-child family dynamic. And that's when parents tend to get most involved. But the traditional research suggests that, well, involvement in a larger scale is important. So how do we encourage that? Virtual settings may self-select involvement. That's another important consideration, at least in these early times of virtual schooling. I think as this becomes more common over time, this will be less of an issue. But at the moment that those parents that are signing up their children for online, virtual, blended, whatever you'd like to call it, settings, they already tend to be the parents that are already more involved in their child's learning. So that's important consideration. And that there's differing viewpoints. Everyone has an opinion. Obviously, that's true about education in general in this society, but also it's specifically in this particular area as well. That different people have different ideas about how much parental involvement there should be, what it should look like, and what policies might be as a result. So definitely there needs to be more study. One of the things that we need to do is understand how this connects, especially to student achievement as well. Very important. So what are some of the implications of what it is that we're taking a look at? Well, first of all, we definitely know that research is needed desperately in this particular area. We need to explore that continuum of parental involvement that Lisa was explaining. We need to understand how parents can encourage their children to practice successful online learning. But related to that, we need to understand how we can provide parents better training to what successful online learning is to be able to support their students to understand online learning. And to begin to do that, we need to get institutions and organizations and schools to understand what successful online learning is and to support that. So you see how it's almost like a cyclical thing, that all of the different organizations or levels need to be involved, and there needs to be a connection between these, and there needs to be some minimal agreement between all of the stakeholders as to what this looks like and how it can be supported, and that's not always an easy thing. We especially need to examine those links between parental involvement and student success. These are definitely done in other studies in other areas, but now that connection in the online settings definitely needs to be more understood. We need to understand those complex natures of parent-student interactions, parent-teacher interactions, parent-teacher-student interactions, all of those different types of things. We need to look at it in all of the different types of virtual settings, whether the hybrid, blended, flipped classrooms even. So we're looking at seeing that this is also related in traditional settings where a flipped approach is used more. That seems to be a more common occurrence these days. Looking at demographics as well and student support, understanding what student perceptions of parental involvement are and getting that more clear as well. And then also policy is definitely needed. So research is needed, but policy is needed. Policy needs to be based on research, obviously, so that the more we understand these complex environments, the more we understand how they may work best or not work best, or what the best practices are. Well, then we can begin a strong policy of what the guidelines are, what the definitions are, what training support, what are the best practices, what do they look like, and how can we support these organizations in understanding that. How can we facilitate and encourage communication? How can we improve school-parent communications to guide parents and increase the continuum of involvement that Lisa was talking about, that's so important. So all of these things really come together. And one of the questions is this something that we can do in a general sense, or is this so specific to particular institutions? Is there some generalities that we can make, or is it something that each organization is going to have to recreate to really understand what it is that they're doing within their own particular environment? Because there's so many, as we mentioned, there's no single definition of what these settings look like. So is a hybrid one different from a flipped classroom? Is a purely online environment different from a hybrid situation? There's so many different possibilities that we definitely need to learn more about what's going on. So overall, what are some of the conclusions that we made in our reviews of literature and some of the research that we did and some of our collaborations, because we're all doing different kinds of things, is that definitely, number one, there's a continuum of parental involvement, and our goal is obviously to increase that towards the more involved side of that continuum. It's interesting that parental involvement factors contribute to student success is still unsubstantiated. So that's something also that's really important. In order to convince, in order to follow the money, you have to have a convincing argument for what it is that you decide you want to spend your scarce resources on. And we do know that we live in an environment and a reality where resources are scarce. So how are we going to show that this makes a difference so that we can then put energy and funds into it? Parental and student interactions are complex. Obviously, I mentioned that one, and we lack research on parental involvement in those specific settings. So maybe even before we begin to generalize our understanding of how we could approach these complex situations, we need to look at individual settings first and start to do more research in blended settings, in flipped settings, in virtual classrooms, and then looking at more together as more of that research is done. But overall, we definitely need to define and reach consensus about what parental involvement is, how it could be supported, and how we could increase the continuum of involvement, especially at least starting at the organizational level. So that's kind of an overall wrap of some of the things that we saw, some of the things that we found interesting, and some of what we learned from our collaborations. So appreciate your attending and attention, and I believe that we are going to turn it over for questions. I think Lisa was on board to help scaffold the questions, but if I put you on the spot, then I apologize.
Yep, I'm here. I've got a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I'll actually go to the last slide. I think it's got our email addresses in case anybody has an interest in following up with one of us or all of us. So again, thanks a lot, Mike and Jered, and our participants, and really appreciate the time and interest in hearing us out here. Any questions? I'm happy to answer them. I think it looks like a few people are typing. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. Just sort of as a side note, while everybody's, or a few of you are typing, I just wanted to let you know that one of the issues that I'm looking at here at the school I'm working in now, while we are a traditional school setting, as I had mentioned earlier, we're one-to-one, and the students here do a lot of work online. And one of the issues that we really need to address is helping students to maintain what we call the school culture when they're online versus when they're in the classroom. And I think that that's a really interesting point, even in any kind of school setting, whether it's blended, flipped, traditional, homeschooling, cyberschooling, just helping students to really maintain their sense of self and their identity, their true identity, when they're working online, I think is just an important perspective, and again, something that we should be sharing with parents, as they're the ones closest to the student when they're working in these cyber charter schools or online K-12 online learning schools. So Just want to throw that out there as possibly another avenue of research, I think. And so, Catherine, with regards to your question, are you working on any research now? Actually, I just met with Jered, as he had mentioned earlier, met him live and in person, and working on a study that he's doing, a really super interesting study. So look forward to that coming out. I think he's hoping that will get published towards the end of June. And Jered, I'll go off mic and maybe you can address that a little bit deeper.
Yes, I think Beth mentioned or asked if there's any research at the high school level, and there isn't much at all. And even with face-to-face researchers tend to focus on younger students. And that's important to note because what the level of involvement can change depending on the age, but also the types of involvement can change depending on age. And so what Lisa was talking about is we conducted, I'm really working on 2 studies right now. One was we interviewed teachers to try to figure out what was going on in their perceptions and experiences. And then we're right now finishing up some analysis on some interviews where we interviewed parents and students, and it's quite interesting because not all parental involvement is positive. Parents can actually interfere with their students' learning, and so we're seeing some of that in the research that's going to come out. And part of that is unintentional. They want to scaffold their students, but they don't really know how to do that correctly, so they kind of end up doing too much of the work. And then in some cases, parents are actually doing the work for their students intentionally. And it only happens with a small group of parents and students, but it does happen. And so how do you prevent that from going on? So when parents do engage, that their engagement is a positive experience and beneficial to students. Exactly. So, you know, it's funny, I was just interviewing or analyzing an interview with a student who worked on a farm, and there are a lot of rural online students. And so because they're home, parents can kind of tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, let's go out and work with the cattle or whatever, or babysit your siblings. And it can be really hard for parents to know that limit as well. So I think that's interesting that you're seeing the same thing. Yep. Yeah. So we've been seeing that a lot. But then we also, for the most part, parents have been fairly good at finding that balance. And on the other side of that, because of the flexibility, some students can work too much. And so one thing that we found in our interviews is that some parents are very good at telling their perfectionist students to take a break. And, you know, why don't you spend some time with us? Or it's okay if you get an A- on that. It's more important that you hang out with your friends or stop working at, you know, midnight or whatever. So, yeah, I think we see it on both ends. Well, thank you for everyone that came. I can stick around if anyone has questions, or we can follow up on email.
All right, thank you so much to our presenters today. Great presentation, good discussion from everyone, so we really appreciate all the participants for coming out as well. We did just want to point out a couple of initiatives by the Research Institute before we wrap up today. If you're interested, you can check out our Virtual Viewpoints podcast by clicking that link there to listen to researchers, practitioners, policymakers, people all along the spectrum who are involved in digital learning and hear about their stories. And you can also apply to be part of our guest blogger program if you have an interest in writing for us. We encourage you to check out the link there to learn more about the guest blogger program and what's required under that initiative as well. We do have an upcoming webinar Tuesday, June 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll hear about teacher mentoring and professional development for teachers. And we'll hear from Kara Dawson and Nancy Dana from the University of Florida. And lastly, if you'd like to stay in touch with us, you can reach us via email, mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list where we announce upcoming webinars and other of our project updates through clicking that link there. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed there, as well as our LinkedIn page, our YouTube channel, where we host the recording of this webinar. So, oh, I'm sorry, did I have the wrong date? That should be Thursday, 6/4. I apologize. Thanks, Beth. Sorry, the YouTube channel where you can see the recording of our webinars there. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar, so we encourage you to share that out with anyone who might have an interest. And you can also check out the listings of our upcoming webinars listed at mvlri.org as well by clicking that link. Thanks, everyone. We encourage all of you to have a great week, and we hope to see you at a webinar again soon. Take care.